They say power reveals who we really are. Not when the world is watching, but when we think no one ever will. On a quiet Friday night, one officer stopped a young man who'd done nothing wrong. No crime. No weapon. No threat. Just skin color, a hoodie, and a handful of assumptions. What began as routine procedure would spiral into a moment the whole city would remember. Because that boy, quiet, polite, and walking home in the rain, wasn't who the officer thought he was. He wasn't another statistic, another face to forget. He was the mayor's only son. And before dawn, that truth would tear open everything the badge was meant to stand for. This is the story of a badge, a boy. And the night justice turned the mirror around. It was a cool Friday evening in the city of Northbridge, a place that looked peaceful on the outside but carried its share of invisible divides. Streetlights flickered above cracked sidewalks. Music pulsed faintly from passing cars. And a soft drizzle glazed the streets in silver. 17-year-old Malik Johnson walked home with his sketchbook pressed against his chest, trying to shield it from the rain. He had just finished a long day at the Community Arts Center where he taught little kids how to draw superheroes and sunsets. To him, art wasn't just a hobby. It was a way to stay out of trouble, to dream beyond the neighborhood that people often whispered about. Malik's world was simple: his mother, his sketches, and his dream of going to art school one day. He was tall, quiet, with a calm presence that made people feel safe. But tonight, under the dim glow of the streetlights, he was about to meet someone who saw none of that. A police cruiser idled on the opposite block, its headlights cutting through the rain. Behind the wheel sat Officer Ray Carter. Ray had been on the force for 12 years. He believed in law and order, but lately, the line between protecting and profiling had grown thin. He'd seen too much, trusted too little, and carried a chip on his shoulder that no badge could hide. He noticed Malik from a distance, hood up, walking alone, hands in his pockets. To Ray, it looked suspicious. He didn't see the art teacher or the boy with dreams. He saw a stereotype. The radio crackled. Ray ignored it. He pulled the car slowly toward the curb, eyes narrowing as Malik crossed the intersection. Let's see what this one's up to. Blue and red lights flashed against Malik's reflection in a shop window. He froze. Not because he was guilty, but because he'd been here before. Different officers. Same story. Malik took a slow breath, lowered his hood, and turned to face the car. Evening, officer. Where you headed, son? Sir. Just a few blocks down. At this hour? With that bag? What's inside? Sketchbooks. Pencils. You can check if you want. Ray's tone hardened. He stepped closer, hand resting casually, but intentionally, on his holster. Raindrops tapped against the metal of his badge. Empty the bag. Let's see for ourselves. Malik hesitated. Not because he was hiding anything, but because every movement felt like walking on glass. One wrong word, one misunderstood gesture. And headlines wrote themselves. He opened his backpack slowly. The sketchbook slipped out and landed in a shallow puddle, the pencil marks bleeding in the water. Ray picked it up. A portrait of a police officer stared back at him. Sharp lines, deep shading, and the word justice scrawled at the bottom. Ray, mocking tone. You an artist, huh? Maybe you should draw something useful. Malik's throat tightened. He wanted to explain. He wanted to say that he drew officers because he admired them once, because his own father had dreamed of joining the force before he died. But the words stayed locked behind pride and fear. Other cars slowed as they passed, headlights briefly illuminating the scene, one boy standing in the rain, one officer holding his notebook like evidence. Ray's partner, Officer Daniels, stepped out from the passenger side. Younger, quieter, and visibly uneasy. Ray, he's just a kid. Let's not. You see the reports lately? Half these kids are running drops. Don't tell me how to do my job. Malik's chest rose and fell. He wasn't crying, but his eyes glistened with the kind of anger that comes from being treated like you don't belong anywhere. Then, just as the moment reached its breaking point, a sleek black car pulled up beside them. Its engine quiet, its windows tinted. The back door opened, and out stepped a man in a long coat and polished shoes. The rain stopped falling, or maybe it just felt that way. Ray turned and froze. The man was Mayor Richard Johnson, Malik's mother's employer, the city's most respected figure. And the boy standing in the rain was his son. The officer froze as the rain fell harder, streaking down the edge of his hat and into his eyes. He had no idea the man stepping out of that sleek black car was the mayor himself, standing tall beneath the stormlight, his coat catching the rain like armor. The air around them shifted, thick with tension and disbelief. The mayor's eyes moved from his son to the officer, his voice steady but sharp enough to slice through the night. He didn't raise it, he didn't have to. The power was in the silence that followed every word. The question hung there between them, heavy as thunder. What exactly did you see when you stopped him? The officer tried to speak, fumbling for the right words, but there were none. His excuses dissolved before they could leave his mouth. The mayor stepped closer, his expression controlled, his anger quiet but unmistakable. For years he had defended the badge, assured the city that its officers could be trusted. But tonight, under the same lights he'd once praised, he saw what so many had tried to tell him. Justice wasn't blind, it was selective. Rain dripped from the officer's sleeve as he handed back the ruined sketchbook, its edges soaked and its drawings blurred beyond recognition. The boy took it with trembling hands, saying nothing. He didn't need to. The shame in the officer's eyes said more than words ever could. The mayor turned away, his hand resting protectively on his son's shoulder. The car door opened, and for a moment the entire street seemed to hold its breath. The flashing blue lights dimmed, fading into the distance as the mayor's car disappeared into the wet night, leaving the officer standing alone beneath the downpour. He stood there long after they were gone, staring at his reflection in the puddle below, distorted, unrecognizable, and for the first time, stripped of authority. By morning, the city was awake, and the story had already spread like fire. Headlines blazed across every screen and paper. Officer detains mayor's son. Talk shows buzzed. The public roared. Some defended him, claiming he was just doing his job. Others said this was proof that power only listens when it's its own blood on the line. For 2 days, the officer didn't leave his house. He sat in silence, uniform folded neatly on the kitchen chair, badge glinting faintly in the dim light. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the boy's face, not angry, not defiant, just disappointed. He had seen that look before, years ago, in another face he'd rather forget. The realization crept in slowly, he wasn't the victim here. He was the warning. Across town, the boy spent the day in his room, sketching again. The lines came slower this time, more deliberate. He drew what he remembered, not as it happened, but as he wished it could have been. The officer stood in the rain, looking down at the word justice, not holding it like evidence, but finally trying to understand it. Weeks passed. The city's attention drifted to new scandals and headlines. But the investigation didn't disappear. The department called the officer in for questioning. The boardroom was silent except for the scratching of pens and the hum of fluorescent lights. His badge sat on the table before him, the metal cold and impersonal. Questions came one after another, sharp and unforgiving. Did the boy resist? Was there a crime? Then why detain him? The officer couldn't answer. The word, suspicious, felt emptier than it ever had. For the first time, he saw how much harm could hide behind something that sounded so harmless. The verdict came quietly, a suspension without pay, pending review. But the punishment wasn't what broke him. It was the reflection of his own actions, finally staring back without excuse. For the first time in 12 years, the badge didn't feel like protection. It felt like a mirror. Months went by. The world moved on. But time, as it often does, had its own way of settling debts. Because stories like these never really end, they wait. And one day, when the waiting was over, the circle would close. The officer who once stood with power at his side would find himself standing before that same young man again. Only this time, everything had changed. Time slipped quietly past the noise of headlines and the anger of protests. Months became a year. The city of Northbridge returned to its usual rhythm, but beneath the surface, memories of that night lingered like faint scars no one could quite forget. The officer had left the force soon after his suspension. Officially, it was called a resignation, But everyone knew it was an ending disguised as choice. He found work in private security, odd jobs that paid the bills but never filled the silence. The badge, once polished every morning, now sat buried at the back of a drawer, an emblem of everything he had been and everything he could no longer defend. He aged faster in that single year than in all the years before it. The uniform had been more than cloth. It had been identity, belonging, purpose. Without it, he was just a man trying to outrun his own shadow. Nights were the hardest. Sometimes he drove the same streets, headlights cutting across the wet asphalt, haunted by the memory of flashing red and blue and the look in a boy's eyes that still burned with quiet disappointment. On one of those nights, fate folded the story back on itself. A letter arrived on crisp paper with the seal of City Hall pressed into the corner. An invitation, simple and unexpected. Community Forum on Police Reform, hosted by Mayor Richard Johnson. The officer almost threw it away. He didn't belong in rooms like that anymore. But curiosity, or perhaps guilt, pulled him there. The evening of the forum, he sat in the back row of the auditorium, trying to disappear among the crowd. The hall smelled of coffee and rain. Voices murmured like the low hum of conscience. At the front of the stage stood a young man, taller now, confident but calm. The face was familiar, older, refined, the same eyes that once looked up at him through the downpour. Malik Johnson, now a youth advocate for the city's new outreach program. The officer felt a strange tightening in his chest. He listened as the young man spoke about fairness, about the need for empathy on both sides of the uniform. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He spoke with the measured grace of someone who had learned that power didn't always need volume. It needed understanding. His words were simple but heavy. Justice begins when fear ends. For the first time, the former officer saw not the boy he had stopped, but the man that boy had become. And in that moment, regret turned into something more useful, accountability. When the forum ended and the crowd rose to leave, he stayed seated, unsure if he should approach. But then Malik stepped down from the stage and walked directly toward him, a quiet smile in his eyes. No words were needed. The young man extended his hand. The officer hesitated, then took it. The handshake was brief, firm, human. In that single gesture, years of shame and anger began to loosen their grip. Malik nodded once before moving on to greet others, leaving the officer standing there in the noise of applause that suddenly felt like forgiveness. Outside, the rain had started again. The city shimmered under the glow of streetlights, the same streets where everything had gone wrong. The officer walked slowly toward his car, the sound of rain mixing with the memory of sirens. But this time, the reflection in the puddles didn't look like a man drowning in regret. It looked like someone learning how to begin again in the local paper. The former officer had joined a volunteer initiative, helping mentor young recruits about ethics and bias in policing. He spoke rarely about his past, but when he did, he told the truth. He told them about a night when a boy with a sketchbook taught him what justice really meant. As for Malik, his art program flourished. Murals began appearing across Northbridge, faces of children, mothers, workers, and one, near the precinct wall, that showed a man in uniform looking into a mirror. Inside the reflection was not power, but humility. Beneath it, in careful brushstrokes, a single word: change. The mural became a landmark, a silent conversation between two worlds. Tourists took pictures. Officers walked past it on their morning shifts. Some nodded, some looked away, but everyone felt its weight. Years later, when the officer was old and the city had changed around him, he would sometimes drive by that wall. He would stop, sit in his car, and watch the people pause to look at the painting. And each time, he would think of the rain, the flashing lights, the voice of a young man who never raised his tone yet reshaped an entire conscience. Injustice had started the story. Pride had carried it. But redemption, that quiet, unglamorous act of owning your wrongs, had written its ending. The night justice turned the mirror around had become something more. It had become the night humanity remembered itself. And in that remembering, both the boy and the man were finally free. Subscribe to Hidden Tales Stories for more powerful life tales that will move, teach, and inspire you. Bell turn on notifications. Don't miss our next story.